All right, we'll be in 2 Kings 17 in just a minute. 2 Kings chapter 17. We won't be flipping much anywhere like the others because this is a focus on the downfall of Israel and there's no parallel text in Chronicles. So we'll be spending our time here looking, and this chapter is about the fall of the northern empire of Israel, and then it talks to us. He goes, and what's a little bit peculiar because the narrator of Kings doesn't do this very often, and that is that he launches into an extended discussion about what led to downfall. Oftentimes their actions are just given to us and no full explanation, or we wished a sermon or a point where God says, and this is not what it should have been, and that's what it should have been. Here we're given one of those extended sermons, and he kind of explains the root of the problem, not every problem, but the root that fueled all the other problems. So it comes to us like this. You see the collapse of the nation of Israel under Hosea, and then you have the sermon itself, and then in verses 24 to 41, which take up a major portion of the chapter, you have some peculiar things there, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. All right, now remember we were introduced, we're going to begin with Hosea in chapter 17 and verse 1. We were actually introduced to him in chapter 15. If you look at verse 29, it says, "In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured these cities, carried them captive to Assyria. Then Hosea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and struck him down and put him to death and reigned in his place." And so he was a part of that chaotic, constant turnover that took place and the constant assassinations that took place over a period of about 13 to 15 years. And so it's under him that there will be downfall. Now the irony of that is that when we've looked at all of the kings, both of Israel and Judah, Judah has some really bad kings, they have some really good kings, and they have some pretty good kings. Israel doesn't have any good ones, but this one, it appears, was probably the best one they ever had. And it's under him that they fall. And so it's kind of interesting. It makes you wonder if maybe they weren't, at least Hosea wasn't starting to see some of the problems that were going on. So it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, which we talked about Ahaz last week in chapter 16, Hosea the son of Elah began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years. Now the name Hosea means salvation, okay, which is kind of ironic because that's not what happens here. Anything but salvation happens, they're conquered. Now Hosea is also an alternative name for the name Joshua. If you look in Numbers 13, 8, and 16, you will see that Joshua, the son of Nun, who led them into the promised land, is actually called Hosea. And so a lot of names, I literally did nothing. I was not even moving. A lot of names, you know what? Let me have the other one. All right. So he begins to reign for us in Samaria, the capital, and he reigns 9 years. And a good portion of those years are spent as a subject king, not in control, actually, just kind of a puppet. So in verse 2, it says, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him." And so he's certainly not righteous, but he's certainly not the most wicked. And one of the things that is conspicuously absent here is that every one of the northern kings you remember there's an attachment to them that they are evil, and then Jeroboam's sin is attached to them, right? They walked in all the ways of their father, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who caused all Israel to sin, but that's absent here, okay? And so it may be, and I forget exactly who it was. I don't think it was Josephus. Someone else, another historian in a Jewish tradition, I think, says that one of the things that, in explaining or commenting on this text, they said that Hosea allowed the people of Israel that wanted to worship God faithfully to go to Jerusalem and to travel that way if they wanted to, which the previous kings had not done. And so that may be the root cause of kind of God's estimation of he was evil, but he didn't maybe just force it the same way that the others had done. He allowed them, if they wanted to go and worship in Jerusalem, which, although under King Ahaz, he embraces idolatry. So that tradition, it's just a tradition. You kind of weigh it a little bit and see what's going on. So in verse 3 it says, against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute. That was in 727 BC is when he did that. And so he becomes his vassal, which is basically he's a puppet king. He's paying him for protection. Verse 4, but the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years besieged it. All right, so the Assyrian king finds a problem because Hosea seeks out So, who was the particular king of Egypt here. So is a personal name, not his, obviously his reigning name would have been Pharaoh. The same way, a lot of those names work that way, Herod and some of the others. Same way president, we call people presidents to this day. So he sends them there searching for help. And he doesn't pay his tribute money to the king of Assyria every year. Now here's the thing, and I think we've mentioned it already, but the prophets really talk about it a lot more than the writer of Kings does. And that is, they were supposed to be dependent upon God for their protection. And to seek out other nations for protection was viewed by God as spiritual adultery. Okay, we'll look at a text in just a minute. And so, let's say you've got Israel here. And so they're in tribute to Assyria, which is over here in the Fertile Crescent. And then they go and they seek help from the king of Egypt, which he's very weak because of internal civil wars, and he can't help much. And so with that in mind, pause right there just a second, and let's go to Hosea chapter 7. And just kind of get a glimpse of this. Isaiah talks about it a lot more. If you go to Daniel and then go to the end, Hosea is next. Hosea chapter 7. He was preaching at this time, and the years before it. He's probably much older at this point when we're reading about it in the Kings. So this is what he says in verse 8 beginning. Ephraim mixes himself with the peoples. The peoples reference to other people groups, people nations, Gentiles. Ephraim is a cake not turned, talking about the fact that they're not complete in their dedication. It says, strangers devour his strength, and he knows it not. Gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, and he knows it not. The pride of Israel testifies to his face, yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. And so what they don't realize, what Israel's not realizing is internally they are weakening. They're constantly weakening. And we talked about this when we got to previous chapters about the Indian summer of Israel, when prosperity got high, but morality got deeper and lower. Okay? And so they thought everything was great because they were prospering again. And so they began to trust in themselves and refusing to turn to the Lord. And when they had problems, which they did, in verse 11 it says this, Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt and going to Assyria. You remember not last week, but the week before in chapter 15, we talked about how the kings were then evaluated as pro-Assyrian or anti-Assyrian in their policies. Okay? So what he's saying here is that. They're like a silly dove. They just fly anywhere for help. They'll fly over to Assyria. Some kings wanted that, some didn't. This king here, he wants to go to Egypt for help. The problem is that the law for kings had a strict rule that said you're not to go back to Egypt ever again, much less to go there to seek protection as a nation. And so this is viewed as adultery in God's eyes, as many of the other prophets make very clear. So he ends up going and in this context talking to them about how he's going to devise evil against them and destroy them, in the fact that they are finding their refuge in these places instead of putting it in God. And so Hosea is going to fall prey to that trap and is probably talked about and included in that particular discussion. So our king in Israel, Hosea, goes down to Egypt to seek help. Again, you've got a civil war with 3 people involved here, so he's not going to prove much help. And so Assyria comes, obviously. They didn't pay their tribute money. And so the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. So he arrests him, takes him to jail, and then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria and for 3 years besieged it. Okay? So you take the king away, you come to Samaria, which is the capital, and it says for 3 years he besieged it. Now, you remember that their way of calculating time is a little bit different than ours. It very well could have been 36 months on the head, right? The 3 years of besieging very well could have been 36 months on the nose. But you and I both know that the way many of them calculated time was if you had parts of, even when you go to the 3 days of Jesus in the tomb, he's not there literally for the exact amount of time, right? 3 days, 3 24-hour segments. He's there portion of one day, all day, and then a portion of another day, okay? So here with years, it's the same way. If they come, say, halfway through or toward the end of a year, that year counts as one, and then the whole year they surround it, and then maybe a month or 2 or 3 or 4, how many ever into the next year. At the very minimum, it's a 14-month siege. That gives you 12 months in between and the last month of the first year and the first month of the last year, at very minimum, okay? So they're besieging the city. They're basically starving it out. We've seen it before in this particular book as well. So he takes Samaria in this process, and that's where he begins in verse 6. And the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria. And he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and Habor and the river of Gozan and the cities of the Medes. And so he will take Israel and, well, I went too far, so my map's going to look a little strange here. It already looks strange, I understand that. But so Babylon, we'll move Babylon and make it right here. Okay, then over here this way that you can't see, way out here, these are the Medes, okay, and the Persians. So he takes Israel captive, and as Assyrian policy dictated, he transported them to the Medes and the Persians in that particular region, which is a region east of Babylon. Okay? And so they're transplanting them in order to, well, let me get ahead of myself. So the king that is mentioned here in this text is Shalmaneser in the first part of the text. He led the besieging. Okay? He started the process. He died, and then the next king that took over was Sargon the second. And Sargon the second says in his writings that he took just shy of 30,000 men of Israel captive and transported them to this region. And that 30,000 men is not obviously including women and children. So Samaria wasn't a big city, or they had been depleted, and then no doubt thousands upon thousands of them died in the besieging process. If it was anything like Jerusalem, where they starved to death, they turned to cannibalism, they turned to all different types of crazy things that God had said they would do. If you read Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And so they have turned to that, and so they're depleted down to about 30,000 people. And remember, in a previous chapter, we've already seen some Israelites deported. And so now this is the rest of them. This is the end for them. All right? And the date of their conquering / transportation is 722, 721 is kind of the general agreed upon date. And so the 10 northern tribes are no more. They're gone. Now, in thinking about this and in reading other people, a number of them have pointed out that, you look at this, and when we get to the besieging of Jerusalem and we read about some of the events involved in it, people say, they look at God and they say, that's harsh. It's a very slim picture of reality, I think. I don't think God was harsh at all, but it's a very slim picture of reality. God promised the 10 northern tribes that they were going to go into captivity for their idolatry. And how long he waited from the time he promised was 200 years. How many good kings did they have in 200 years? None. As one writer put it, it was the sheer grace of God for 200 years that allowed them to stand. You see, people, they look at and they see, they only want to focus in on the part where God finally brings down judgment. They don't want to pay attention to the 200 years when he begged them, literally begged them, which we'll get into in just a minute, literally begged them to change their way. And that's where we come to now. In verse 7, as the narrator of the Kings walks us through this process. Now, one of the things we want to see about this, because their main downfall is idolatry. There were a lot of other things. Their mistreatment of the poor comes up very often. Their mistreatment of the orphan and the widow comes up very often, not just in this book, but also in the prophets. They're going after, as we've already talked about, seeking help from foreign nations. A number of sins come to the forefront, but the one that is beneath all of them is their idolatry. Okay? And in idolatry, this is the true maxim that it's kind of held true all throughout history. And that is, human beings will become like the being that they worship. So worship, allegiance, dictates ethics. Okay? And that's where, this is where this gets, we could spend a long time on this analysis alone. We won't, but we could. Where we talk about why worship is so important, about orienting the believer in the ways of God to keep them from being drawn away to another God, which then corrupts their ethics. But it all begins, listen, if you see a person today, and we've seen it, and we see leaders, we see other people, we see them become moral failures, or we see them walk away from faith or walk away from the church, and people go, I don't know what happened. How could they just leave like that? Here's the answer. They didn't just leave. They didn't just leave. They didn't just become a moral failure. They had been doing this for a long time. Slowly but surely, the object of their worship ceased to be God, and it turned into something else. And slowly but surely, as their image, their ethics, their focus on God and their ethics began to wane, something else slid in and took its attention, and their ethics for that God began to increase, and so you had a crossing. And that's how you get to the moment that somebody walks away. But it all begins with what you hold primary, and that is the being that we worship. And this becomes a little more tricky for us because as Americans, mostly I would say, we don't have a problem with carving out idols and actually bowing down to them. It's far more subtle than that. Far more subtle than that. You know, a lot of people, they look at idolatry and they say those people are foolish. How could they carve out a block of wood and then, knowing that they carved it out, fall down and worship it? Listen, I agree with you. The prophets agree with you. That's an argument they make. But, I mean, I got to tell you, it may be a little smarter than us. I mean, they at least chose a stump. We choose a dollar bill. I mean, my experience is a tree usually holds up a lot better than a dollar bill under pressure. But we'll get to those things when we draw out this side. So this is what he does beginning. Well, one more thing before we get into that. And that is that not only, and we'll see it illustrated in the opening words here, not only is it changing the object of your worship, but the changing of the object of worship begins in a very specific place. And Paul makes this point in Romans 1 when he talks about, we've mentioned it before, when he talks about that digression of sin where you just go downward and downward and downward. That the specific point of departure from your God is when you cease to be thankful for who your God is and for what your God has done. The moment that you and I cease to be thankful, we cease to be blown away by who God is and what God has done for us, that's a moment we're taking a step, and we need to be very, very careful at that moment. Because if we abandon that step, it can be hard, incredibly hard to get people back to that step. You have to teach people to fall in love with Jesus again, and that's not always easy. Not because he's not lovable, but because familiarity can breed contempt. And they're so familiar with him, they no longer appreciate his uniqueness. So, this is what he says. And this occurred because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh and the king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. This happened because they sinned against God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh. Why does he say that? Of all the moments, why does he draw them back to, first of all, what is this moment he's speaking of? God brought them up out of the land of Egypt. What is this moment he's speaking of? It's got a whole book named after it. Exodus, okay? He's speaking of the Exodus. It's their moment of deliverance. When God delivered them from the bondage of Egypt. For us, the parallel, as the New Testament lays it, is the moment that we come up from the waters of baptism as they were baptized under the cloud and into the sea. 1 Corinthians 10, in the Red Sea, that was their baptism. That moment when we are initially justified. The moment we forget to be thankful for this right here is the moment we start getting in trouble. Because what happens is this, through time, God starts to clean our life up for us a little bit. Okay? And so we can get this notion that says that, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. I'm actually a pretty good person. And we forget who we were. Now there's a balance that has to be struck there, right? I believe we should remember our past, our sinful past. But not to the degree that it cripples us, that we're always worried that God never forgave it, but to the degree that we can remind ourselves the moment we start thinking that maybe we've become something, maybe we've become something pretty special, we can remember that there was nothing special about us. And that helps us to keep appreciating that moment. It helps us appreciate every moment that follows. Who would have thought that this kid who started out way over here and all of this sinfulness would one day wind up over here? So what's the explanation from going to this point to this point? It has to be God. And that's why you see some of the greatest servants of God, when you talk to them about, quote, accomplishments, and when you say that word to them, they laugh. And you know why they laugh? Because they know they're not the explanation for it. You can't call it an accomplishment. You can't call it something I did. God is the only explanation for who brought me that far. There is thankfulness for that moment. The Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the God who loved you and saved you when there was nothing lovable about you. And there was nothing lovable about me. They sinned against him, and they feared other gods. Gods who had done nothing for them. Hosea talks about this. You might want to read in an extended, we don't have time to look into it, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, when he talks about their extended idolatry. So, in fearing other gods, what did they begin to do? They began to walk in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people. Why did God drive out the people, the Amorites, as they're called in summary, or sometimes called Canaanites by other people, but Genesis 15, God calls them the Amorites, so we'll stick with that one. Why did God drive out the Amorites? We've talked about this. He didn't just give Israel this land because he liked them more than the other people. So why did he drive them out? Why did he use Israel to drive them out? They were sinful. He used Israel to punish them the same way he used Assyria to punish Israel, and the same way he's going to use Babylon to punish Jerusalem. The standard operation of God in geopolitics is this: the nation that is being punished is many times far less wicked than the nation who distributes the punishment. You know, during Cold War times, people said God would never let America fall because Russia is a godless nation. Actually, if you read the Old Testament, that narrative should have been reversed. It probably would have made a ton of sense for that to happen. Because God always uses nations more wicked than the nation he's punishing. And then he punishes that wicked nation with a nation more wicked than them. And so they began to do all the things that these nations had done before them. Child sacrifice, worshiping idols, worshiping the heavens, worshiping all these different things. What is it about the ways of other people that the people of God are so enamored with them that we have this tendency to want to be like them? Think about this. Think about the people that so many people hold up as heroes. Why is that person heroic to you? Listen, I'm not against having sports heroes, people that, you know, you're amazed at their abilities to do the game, whatever. But a lot of those guys, not a one of them could stay faithful to their wife. Not a one of them even know who their kids are. They can't string a sentence together without a 4-letter word. They literally have the vocabulary of a toddler. And we say, you know, that's the person I want to be like. Why? Because he's worth $100 million? Who cares? What good is $100 million if you're an absolute failure in the things that money cannot buy? Which is your relationship with God, your relationship with your spouse, and your relationship with your children. What good is that? It may feel more obtainable. Well, I don't know. The ease of life, yes. Yes. That portion seems to be, it's easier. I mean, that's why Jesus describes it as a broad way, and a lot of people go down it. So the challenge for the people of God is always to make sure, I'm going to tell you, rarely have I ever seen the things that are most important in life, rarely are they ever going to be easy. I've rarely ever seen that, right? Because if it were easy, you know what everybody else would do? They'd do it. And it's like I remember one man saying to another young man he was coaching, he said, look, don't get frustrated. It's supposed to be hard. If it were easy, everybody else would be doing it. So we have to keep that challenge of not wanting to become. We need to ask ourselves, why do I hold this world? Why do I hold some of these things in such admiration? Why do I think this is something that I need to throw my life into? Because a lot of times it's just stuff and accolades from people who, I mean, if you've dealt with people long enough, surely you know that the accolades of people are here one minute and they are gone the next. The same people who love you in one breath will curse you in the next breath. That is just a solid fact. They love you as long as you're doing what they want you to do. And you do exactly as they think you should do. It won't last. So the big danger is that we change your object of worship, you start becoming like all the other people that worship him, and you start getting those ugly results too, which is what we'll dive into next week when we pick up here at verse 9.